Try to think of a movie that has no conflict. Conflict, whether it's caused by people, places, or emotions, are a very important part in most movies that keep the story propelling forward or keep the audience intrigued. Now maybe you've managed to think of one, but I'm going to assume that if you have thought of one, you are slowly realizing that it does actually have conflict. One very prominent form of conflict comes from villains. Villains are what ultimately define these monumental narratives that you grow to cherish. Personally for me, my love for movies began when my father decided to renovate the basement of our home into as close to a movie theater as possible. He bought movie posters, reclinable couches, a popcorn machine, and of course, a giant TV. Here we watch some of our favorite movies with both friends and family. The more I watched movies, the more I realized that these villains were not just engaging devices for entertainment, but also ways for us to engage in, or also learn about ourselves and the world around us. To start, I would like to talk about a villain from the movie The Godfather, Michael Corleone. Okay. Shall I?
Whatever works.
Will this work? Okay. The movie The Godfather, Michael Corleone. Michael had just returned home from the war when we find him, and he had hoped to start a new life, one that was completely separate from that of his criminal empire family. However, his loyalty towards his family is what slowly pulls him down into the criminal underworld. Al Pacino, the actor who played as Michael Corleone, said this about his character. He said, "I never saw him as a gangster, no. I saw him as someone who inherited this thing and did not expect to be there at an earlier part in his life, but realized it was his responsibility and his destiny." Michael's motivations dramatically shifted after the assassination attempt on his father. Driven by a sense of revenge and responsibility, his actions became increasingly more violent. Through Michael, we are able to realize how much of a compelling villain he is due to the fact that he can switch up his attitude and he can use the excuse that his actions, no matter how ruthless they are actually for the necessary survival of his family. His transformation from a war hero to a ruthless mafia leader demonstrate and showcase the allure for power and its corrupting influence that it can have on an individual, also to how much they can seek for their morals. No matter how much they seek to benefit themselves, they can always corrupt anything that they wish. So Michael, consumed by his own ambition and by the consequences of his choices, we are able to witness the transformation from someone who had so much potential to someone who was overall consumed by darkness. Moving on to our next villain, we leave the tragedy that is Michael, and we move over to the psychological depths of a character such as Norman Bates in the movie Psycho. Norman Bates is portrayed as a polite young man who runs the isolated Bates Motel under the watchful eye of his mother. This facade of normality hides the dark secrets that lurk beneath. It's the connection between the two that make Norman such an amazing villain, his ability to switch between acting innocent and acting malevolent. Anthony Perkins, the actor who played as Norman Bates, said this about his character. "I do have affection for Norman as a person. He does the best he can out of his diminished circumstances with which his personality surrounded him." Norman's transformation from a villain start from his traumatic upbringing as well as his the psychological grip from his mother. Norman's journey teaches us the impact that unresolved trauma can cause and the influence of parental care over their children if they are not the best. So he teaches us that life, we don't have as much control over our lives as we like to think, as well as how our past can shape us in ways we don't truly understand or actually have any control over. As we dive deeper into his psyche and progress through the movie, we learn the true extent of his terrifying nature. So this is a spoiler alert. I don't know, this movie's 60 years old, so you shouldn't blame me. It's now revealed that Norman has a split personality, one where he would switch between that of his own and that of his mother. He did this in order to escape the guilt that he felt for murdering her, as well as to completely avoid acknowledging her death altogether. He would even go as far as to dress like her and to talk to himself in her own voice, in her voice. So Norman's journey overall teaches us that we should always focus on our mental health, and that we should never neglect our own well-being. His quick descent into madness reveals the cause, or the impact that unresolved trauma can have on an individual. Moving into our next villain, we leave the psychological depth of Norman and we approach the embodiment of pursuit, that is Anton Chigurh, from the movie No Country for Old Men. Anton is initially introduced as a hitman, a ruthless hitman, who is tasked with retrieving money. Norman's actions are completely devoid of any personal vendetta and rather follow a strict set of internal absolute rules. He's defined by his strict moral code as well as his ruthlessness, no matter the circumstance. This is mostly demonstrated through his use of a coin, in which he will use a coin toss to dictate the fate of his victims, leaving it up to chance. The actor Javier Bardem, who plays this character, said this about his character. He said the least human of them all, as well as just violence. He even went as far as to initially decline the role due to his absolute hate for violence. But that's what makes this character such an amazing villain. It's his ability to completely avoid all detachment, or have detachment from everything, as well as to not be driven by any sort of desire, but by rather follow strict moral rules and his code, as well as everything that he's followed so far in life. Through his journey, we learn that evil does not always come with a tragic backstory or a rational explanation. It simply exists. His journey reminds us that our world is often unpredictable, and that confusion in our world is often an illusion, and which brings us moments of brief relief from any hardship. So here we have a man who was forced into his family's criminal empire due to the weight of legacy as well as loyalty. We have another man who was twisted by his traumatic upbringing as well as his psychological grip from his mother, and another man who embodies the randomness of fate as well as following his own twisted code forever. Now what if I told you that these three characters are actually the protagonists of their own movie? And if not the direct protagonist, can be viewed as a protagonist through the manipulation of context. Here's the definition of protagonist, and here's the definition of antagonist. As you can see, neither have any defining character traits which define either as good or bad. And protagonists who display morally questionable actions can indeed appear as the antagonist, without any context. This is very similar to how individuals in our society can be misunderstood due to not understanding their circumstances or their motives. The individuals in our lives, we will come across people whose actions we don't initially understand. We won't initially understand. But just as these three cinematic villains are shaped by their circumstances and their upbringing and their motives that they've experienced throughout their whole lives, so too are the people we meet in our everyday lives. So, next time you come across someone whose actions you don't initially understand, take a moment to consider their story. Look beyond the surface and you might just realize that these villains that we call them might actually just be another protagonist trying to navigate their own narrative. Thank you.